The palace provided only evasive explanations when Prince Louis abruptly stopped attending public gatherings. However, something much more terrifying was taking place behind the well-crafted royal statements. This wasn't only a privacy issue. It was a planned getaway that concealed a family crisis for which no one was ready. And suddenly, the quiet is being broken. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve further into what this actually implies for the royal family. The absence seemed nearly innocuous at first. One missed appearance, followed by another. A rearranged timetable that was intended to pacify rather than educate, explained away with soothing smiles and well-known phrases. The palace relied on language that it had honed over many years, words that were meant to seem comforting, yet to communicate nothing at all. Regular education. Time spent with family. A youngster growing up in the background. Every word fell softly. They did, however, form a wall. But the inquiries were louder outside the palace gates. Parents took note. Commentators hesitated. There was something wrong with the timing. This was hardly a slow retreat. It came suddenly, final, nearly practiced. Additionally, flawless rehearsals typically indicate that terror struck first. Speculation was rampant on the internet. There were notions that were written off as cruel imagination. Others were cleaned in silence in a matter of hours. Accounts stopped working. Posts disappeared. The algorithms changed. The official story tightened as more people spoke. It was enough to unnerve onlookers. After all, silence sometimes speaks louder than denial. Public appearances persisted. However, something was lacking. With calm expressions and simulated warmth, William and Catherine took the stage. But they were different in their spirit. Their grins were fleeting, as though anticipating questions they hoped would never be answered. Their gazes swept across crowds. Every appearance without Louis made the absence seem more significant, transforming interest into worry. The press started seeing connections between things it had been taught not to notice. There were patterns. Some photographers had their assignments abruptly changed. Within minutes of each other, the same briefings were sent to certain sources, uniform messaging delivered with surgical precision, no leaks, no murmurs. It's never by accident that you have so much control. It's turned on. One word muttered more than any other was used by insiders to characterize the atmosphere behind closed doors. Confinement. Not defense, not give a damn. Confinement. The notion that whatever was happening needed time, silence, and boundaries. The monarchy seldom permits itself to do so until something jeopardizes its very reputation. This was unique not only because the infant was missing, but also because of how quickly the palace removed him from sight. No light-hearted remarks, not a single humorous story, no more references. It was as though a whole presence had been abruptly taken from the story by flipping a switch. One truth became inevitable as soon as that knowledge sank in. This was never an impromptu quiet. It was planned. It was decided. Furthermore, it was concealing something much more significant than the general people had been made to believe. However, the timeline gets more lucid the further you go into it. Louis wasn't the first to go missing. Beneath the royal gates, it started with something far darker. Although he wasn't the first royal child to abruptly withdraw, Prince Louis could have been the most important. The indicators were visible in retrospect. Catherine's tight grins, frantic cancellations, and abrupt scheduling changes. What did they have to conceal? The British monarchy has always exercised surgical care in handling its optics. Every look, every move, every quiet moment was deliberate. However, the pattern was broken with Prince Louis. His absence from little gatherings initially appeared harmless enough. Priorities change as kids grow up, but those who keep up with the royal rhythm are able to see irregularities. And with startling rapidity, this was erased from public life, not just a missed occurrence. In royal circles, history tends to repeat itself, frequently with disastrous results. and it was difficult to overlook the similarities to Princess Margaret's early withdrawals from the spotlight for those who were listening. For many reasons, Margaret had been concealed: health issues, emotional instability, and humiliation in the palace. However, the royal departure plan was uncannily similar. Silences that were well planned, abrupt disappearances, and narratives that were polished just enough to make it difficult to find the truth. There was something more profound going on with Louis. His last public appearances caused a lot of people to feel uneasy. There were brief instances throughout significant events when he appeared disengaged, his eyes straying and his face expressionless. He failed to recognize the crowds at one high-profile event, which was so unusual that it caused rumors in the royal press. People were more afraid of him than they would have been of a tantrum, since he didn't appear bashful or belligerent. Experts in body language quickly offered their opinions. The video slowed down to a crawl. Analysis of expressions, frame by frame. Louis' stance appeared more rigid to onlookers, avoiding making eye contact. There were times when his siblings leaned into conversations while Louis backed off just a little. These were indications of stress rather than rebellion. But the change in William and Catherine was more telling than Louis's actions. Their once radiant friendliness became reserved, almost scripted, when they talked about their children. The light-hearted quips about school pickups and bedtime routines had vanished. Rather, Catherine would hesitate, smile, and then change the subject when someone asked about Louis. William, who is often quite expressive, used formal language that carried the emotional impact of a press release. It seemed more like terror than privacy. The school change followed. Unusually quickly, quietly, and covertly, Louis was removed from his former institution. Although there were few details, a new school was revealed, and the media was quickly told to respect the change. What ought to have been a significant event became a disappearance. No pictures, interviews, or leaks. However, the most damning information came from insiders rather than from reporters or royal observers. Employees started whispering about strange procedures and internal briefings mentioning extra vigilance. Staff changes become more frequent. The estate is divided into certain wings for restricted access. Senior aides declined to provide direct answers when asked for clarity. There was just one thing that was evident. Louis' predicament was fragile and may endanger the monarchy if handled poorly. It was more than a child feeling overburdened. It had to do with anything unsaid, a fact that is too sensitive for the general audience. Silence and ceremony had always concealed the crown's cracks, but this time was different. There was a name for this phobia. However, what caused this event to be so combustible that the palace was unable to spin it if there was a precedent for this pattern? Few people ever went into the room where the solution was. Few people are aware that there is an ultra-private medical wing hidden deep beneath the royal walls that is only utilized in dire circumstances. Weeks before the public even became aware of Prince Louis's absence, he had been sent there. The events taking place in that room were never intended to be seen by daylight. The Royal Medical Wing is more of a fortress than a clinic, concealed beneath layers of stone, security, and secrecy. Few people are able to access it. Fewer yet are aware of who is treated there and why. It is the last place any royal wants to wind up, since, by the time you enter, everything has already gone horribly wrong. It was designed for discretion. Prince Louis was transported there. Not later, but before the public became aware of it. The public didn't even realize he was gone for weeks before the first suspicions were raised. Naturally, confirmation did not come from the palace. It wouldn't. It came from disillusioned aides, retired employees of the fringe, and people who had just enough permission to view what they weren't supposed to. It was discreetly revealed by one former palace staffer who had been securely dismissed from royal service. Late one night, Louis had been transferred to the suite with the utmost secrecy. No formal logs, no announcements, just a silent transfer at midnight, followed by an abrupt information blackout. The medical wing's entrances and exits were no longer informal after that. Long after midnight, family members were observed coming through side gates. Not a single motorcade. Don't press. Just desperation and solitude. During those nights, a single car registered to Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, was recognized several times. After spending hours there, she would depart by herself, pale, keep quiet, barely able to stand at times. One evening, she didn't come home till the next morning. She sobbed at her son's bed for the majority of that night, according to insiders. This stay wasn't merely preventative, it was crisis management. Within days, experts started to show up. Not just any physicians, specialists in uncommon developmental disorders were transported in under aggressive confidentiality agreements that circumvented standard diplomatic clearances. One American doctor was escorted straight via a back tunnel, bypassing all major exits while accompanied by legal counsel. One leak claims that the professional was there to confirm something rather than merely cure. Whatever the diagnosis, it was a game changer. Internal personnel received instant protocol upgrades to guarantee complete containment. Under legal oversight, non-disclosure agreements that were already common for royal employees were updated, reissued, and signed. After voicing concerns about the increased secrecy, one employee was abruptly fired. Another was sent to Scotland indefinitely. It was an obvious message. This was not an ordinary circumstance. Whispers would also be penalized. The mood within the medical suite was described as quiet and strained. To avoid burnout, nurses worked short shift rotations. Every night, medical records were taken out and taken off-site. Throughout it all, the youngster at the heart of this tucked down behind layers of dread, care, and protection, this storm remained silent. The details of what was going on in that secret area were kept well disguised. However, one thing became indisputable. This was more than just a medical problem. The Crown had no precedent for such an emergency. A cherished and conspicuous royal child was now silently battling something the monarchy was unable to comprehend or endure. But what was being treated wasn't the only mystery. What had been found was it. Genetics and legacy conceal a secret that the monarchy had hoped would never come to light. A latent genetic strain that had been traced back generations was concealed in Louis's DNA, a silent legacy of suffering, shame, and an intolerable decision. The royal medical wing fell silent instantly upon the results of the testing. What had been conjecture solidified into reality. It was long believed that Prince Louis's unusual and recessive genetic marker had been eradicated from the royal family. The truth, however, was more devastating. It was still there. All it had been doing was hiding and waiting, and it was back now. Through Queen Victoria's ancestors, the strain was traced back not only to recent history but also to the very foundations of royal lineage, a branch polluted with a sickness too hazardous to disclose in public. The royal physicians were shocked. This was neither a developmental delay nor a childhood sickness. It was a silent illness that was almost undetectable in the beginning, but might have disastrous results. An uncommon and unique illness that had previously generated political unrest throughout European monarchies. They said, "The ghost of the royal disease is hemophilia." It might topple dynasties again as it done in the past. The consequences extended well beyond the field of medicine. The future of the monarchy was at stake, not simply Louis's health. Questions would fly through constitutional channels if they were made public. Would a youngster with such a condition be deemed stable enough to take on royal responsibilities? Would he be viewed as a liability by the public? Would Parliament take action to remove him from the succession in a covert manner? These arguments were no longer theoretical. They were quick, real, and frightening. Inside the palace, William and Catherine had to decide whether to expose the truth and risk destabilizing the country, or to keep their son safe and face the consequences of later public revelation. More caution than clarity was contributed by each legal counsel included in the circle. This situation has no precedents. There is no protocol for a contemporary monarchy that is endangered by the same lineage it was established to protect. A crucial meeting, according to a royal source, changed everything. There was tension in the room. They brought in legal documents. Charts from the past are shown. After a few minutes of silence, a senior royal finally spoke, using a word that would reverberate in whispered conversations. This risk was always known to us. Just that statement hinted at something more profound. Within the House of Windsor, a long-standing awareness of hereditary vulnerability was silently passed down, from generation to generation, like a curse whispered. The fight, however, was not only legal or medical, notwithstanding the science. It was quite emotional. William had to make a choice that no heir should ever have to make after spending his entire juggling his personal identity with his royal duties. According to reports, Catherine, who was always the calm pillar, was distraught. Not for the scandal or the throne, but more for the burden imposed on a child who is too young to comprehend it. They continued to wait, awaiting further responses, awaiting guidance, waited for the right moment to provide a remedy that neither the monarchy nor medicine could. Because it wasn't all about Louis in the end. It had to do with what Louis represented, a flawless child torn between two flawed traditions, vulnerability and power. But science wasn't the only threat for a family based on responsibility and appearance. Whispers were considerably more perilous than DNA. Rumors of treachery? In private, William and Catherine had difficulties. Someone in the family went too far. A senior tabloid editor received confidential information. Only a royal would be aware of these details. And where did it come from? That would be Queen Camilla. It started out quietly, as these things frequently do. Buried deep in a column was a line, a quote that felt overly exact, a slightly cropped image that conveys a sense of unease. It was initially written off as media phishing, with opportunists taking advantage of the void created by Prince Louis's absence. However, the story later changed. The coverage took on a more acerbic tone. Words like condition, genetic, worry, and extended care proliferated within days of one another in rival magazines that hardly ever had a common issue. Behind the royal doors, suspicions quickly erupted. Up until it wasn't, the close-knit group protecting Louis's medical truth was unbreakable. A troubling trace was found during a digital examination. Encrypted communications from a burner phone belonging to an employee who hadn't been spotted on royal property in weeks. The information contained in those texts was nearly identical to what was being reported in the tabloids. Further investigation into the sender's recent correspondence uncovered a pattern. Consistent communication with a well-known media liaison who had previously worked for Camilla's private office. The ramifications were profound. The unwritten rule of royal secrecy was broken in a matter of hours. Catherine, who was already struggling with her son's illness, insisted on answers. She asked for a private meeting with Charles, not through aides but on her own initiative. Sources later disclosed that the meeting descended into violence. The trail, the time, and the motivation were all laid out by Catherine. Visibly shaken, Charles allegedly initially defended Camilla until Catherine delivered the last piece, which was the identical words of a press remark that Camilla had used in private just days before. Camilla's purported defense was icy. "We have a right to know what comes next." It wasn't betrayal in her thinking. Preservation was the reason. A concealed weakness in the lineage couldn't afford to surprise a monarch in waiting. However, it was unacceptable to the rest of the family. Anne was furious. It was a breach of blood trust, according to Edward. Camilla had gone too far for an organization that relies on loyalty and confidentiality, and she did it for power rather than out of concern. William remained silent. He didn't have to. He disappeared. He missed family get-togethers and engagements for weeks. He had momentarily left their Windsor home, palace insiders whispered, not out of rage but in shock. It had not been a journalist who had betrayed them. It had originated from within the home, from someone who had promised to keep the family safe rather than reveal its most vulnerable aspects. This was an incision right into the core of the Regal Foundation, not merely a leak, something that couldn't be put back together in a ceremony or in quiet. However, the treachery was only a spark. The public unraveling of a royal couple's private conflict was followed by an explosion. She was referred to be the unwavering pillar of the palace. However, under strain, even pillars can crack. Catherine's carefully constructed world fell apart as the truth about Louis started to surface, and she herself disappeared for the first time. Absences that were justified as mild were the first. A sudden illness there, a scheduling conflict here. However, those who kept a close eye knew better. Catherine never shied away from her responsibilities, or allowed the institution to fail because of her. Her absence from activities, particularly those pertaining to kids, charities, or education, was a sign of something more serious than fatigue. A brief statement was issued by the palace, claiming health concerns, while something far more delicate was eroding in the background. A former employee smuggled footage showing Catherine leaving the royal hospital wing in the wee hours of the morning, and it quickly found its way into private media circles. Her hands were shaking, her shoulders were drooping, and her face was pallid. Neither security nor assistants were around her, nothing but quiet. A woman who had lost her temper. Although the film was brief, less than a minute, it managed to convey something that no press release could. Not the Duchess, but the mother. Shattering under the weight of the unthinkable, William was spotted sitting in a parked automobile outside the Windsor estate the same morning. By themselves? Looked down, not moving. According to witnesses, he sat there staring out the windshield for almost 40 minutes without making any calls or issuing any commands. The moment the crown appeared too heavy to wear, according to a passing vehicle. Even her inner circle was unable to control Catherine's sadness behind closed doors. There were rumors that she had collapsed when speaking with Louis's physicians. Panic episodes, unexpected fainting, an unwavering sense of guilt had grown, one that no mother ought to bear. She felt that she had failed to shield him from the world he was born into, not from disease. She confided in a close friend that she was afraid Louis would be viewed as a relic rather than a child. Not a little lad, but a royal secret and a sign of weakness. Even her closest confidants were taken aback by Catherine's decision at that moment. She refused to expose George and Charlotte to a family that no longer felt safe, which is why she pulled them from planned public activities rather than for the sake of scandal management or strategic optics. She was aware of the palace machine's ability to spin, control, and manipulate. However, it was unable to provide solace. It was incapable of grieving. Furthermore, it was unable to comprehend what it was like to watch your child gradually disappear by decree. The image of Catherine, who was frequently portrayed as the elegant and flawless Duchess of Cambridge, was now replaced by something unvarnished, genuine, and heartbreaking. A mother on the verge of collapse, devastated by her own impotence, rather than by external pressure. The crown was unable to conceal the anguish that was left behind after the mask had finally fallen. William decided to stop playing palace games and make a move that might rock the monarchy, while Catherine broke in silence. Prince William had witnessed the destruction of his mother's life due to royal secrecy. His own son now posed the prospect of repeating history. William, however, was not going to be mute this time. William had fulfilled the crown's requests for years. He gave the lines, donned the smile, and acted out the part. However, something within of him exploded as he saw Louis buried beneath layers of bureaucratic denial and Catherine crumble under the weight of sadness. There was more to this than just a youngster. The system in question swallowed suffering in order to preserve power. William had also seen the end of the journey. He and Diana had experienced it together. Silently, the breaking point occurred. Kensington was to host a meeting in the morning, No fanfare, no publicity. However, all key royal advisors were called in behind closed doors. William sat at the head of the table, not as an heir or a prince, but as a parent. What came next was more of a proclamation than a debate. William insisted on openness. Not in a few months, not following yet another leak in the media. Instant resistance was the reaction now. Advisors issued warnings on national stability, tradition, and precedent. William, however, refused to be swayed. He was too familiar with the price of silence. One by one, he presented the facts. The disintegration of the family, Louis's health, and the media leaks. Then he offered them an option. Assist him in preparing the truth, else he would deliver it on his own. Although it was an unexpected threat, it wasn't meaningless. Later, it was revealed by several palace sources that William had told Charles in private that if the crown did not deal with the matter honestly, he would take an indefinite leave of absence from public duties, not as a kind of discipline, but rather as a decision to stop engaging in deception. The picture of a contented household could no longer be maintained. The price had risen too much. The palace's public relations apparatus went into overdrive in a matter of hours. Drafts were created, discarded, and then revised. Attorneys argued over each sentence. Advisors were terrified of the public's reaction. How much should be disclosed? What wording could diffuse the situation without causing a constitutional crisis? Every choice turned into a conflict. William, however, remained firm throughout. Not a spin. Avoidance is not an option, just the truth. Charles begged for more time because he was caught between paternal affection and institutional allegiance. His goals were to safeguard Louis, Catherine, and the concept of monarchy itself. But William, unflinching and determined, set a deadline. The crown had been in the dark long enough for the populace to know. The future king was ready to walk, and if he did, everything the monarchy stood on, tradition, unity, and perception, would collapse behind him, stated a court assistant. The world had been waiting for the palace to make this momentous decision, but no one was prepared to accept it as time ran out and pressure increased. Prince William had witnessed the destruction of his mother's life due to royal secrecy. His own son now posed the prospect of repeating history. William, however, was not going to be mute this time. William had fulfilled the crown's requests for years. He gave the lines, donned the smile, and acted out the part. But something inside of him snapped as he saw Louis concealed under layers of institutional denial and Catherine crumble under the weight of sadness. There was more to this than just a youngster. The system in question swallowed suffering in order to preserve power. William had also seen the end of the journey. He and Diana had experienced it together. Silently, the breaking point occurred. Kensington was to host a meeting in the morning. Not a pump, no notice to the public. However, all key royal advisors were called in behind closed doors, and William, not as a prince or an heir, but as a parent, sat at the head of the table. What came next was more of a proclamation than a debate. William insisted on openness, not in a few months, not following yet another leak in the media. Right now. Instant resistance was the reaction. Advisors warned about national stability, tradition, and precedent. William, however, refused to be swayed. He was too familiar with the price of silence. One by one, he presented the facts. Louis's health, the media breaches, the family fractures. Then he offered them an option. If you don't help him prepare the truth, he will deliver it on his own. Although it was an unexpected threat, it wasn't meaningless. Later, it was revealed by several palace sources that William had told Charles in private that if the crown did not deal with the matter honestly, he would take an indefinite leave of absence from public duties, not as a kind of discipline, but rather as a decision to stop engaging in deception. The picture of a contented household could no longer be maintained. The price had risen too much. The palace's public relations apparatus went into overdrive in a matter of hours. There were drafts, discarded, revised. Attorneys argued over each sentence. Advisors were terrified of the public's reaction. How much should be disclosed? What wording could diffuse the situation without causing a constitutional crisis? Every choice turned into a conflict. William, however, remained firm throughout. Not a spin. Avoidance is not an option. Just the truth. Charles begged for more time because he was caught between paternal affection and institutional allegiance. He wished to keep Louis safe, keep Catherine safe, preserve the concept of monarchy itself. But William, unflinching and determined, set a deadline. The crown had been in the dark long enough for the populace to know. The future king was prepared to walk, according to one royal attendant. And all the monarchy stood for, perception, unity, and tradition, would fall apart behind him if he did. The world had been waiting for the palace to make a startling move, but no one was prepared to accept it as the pressure increased and time ran out. The royal press office issued a brief, clinical statement at precisely 9 in the morning. However, the impact of its words would be felt worldwide. No longer was the truth concealed. Since the palace had been concealing what they believed would destroy them, Prince Louis was no longer visible. Teams of advisors, legal specialists, and public relations handlers examined the meticulously crafted document, which was 2 paragraphs long. However, its power was not lessened by its briefness. The palace stated that Prince Louis was undergoing long-term care for a complicated ailment in a cool, collected manner. The condition was not named. They didn't go into detail about its origins. However, they did admit that something had been wrong all along, something they could no longer deny. The word rare complications was a siren's call. It was both specific and ambiguous, a deterrent to conjecture and an acknowledgement of failure. Broadcasts were disrupted by news organizations worldwide in a matter of minutes. There was a social media craze. The distinction between scandal and empathy was blurred in headlines, as Louis-related hashtags trended in dozens of nations. The narrative was out of control. It was volatile. It was alive. And it could not be stopped. What came next was much more explosive than the statement itself. A few hours later, William and Catherine sent out a private message. It was unprocessed, emotional, and without the typical regal luster. The condition was not directly addressed by them. Rather, they spoke as worn-out, fragile parents who were desperate to preserve what little solitude they still had. They requested comprehension. They requested room. In the process, they disclosed more information than any medical record could. The globe reacted in waves. Thousands of people offered supportive remarks. There were public vigils outside royal homes, but support wasn't the only response. Anger was also present. Rage over the quiet months. Rage at the palace for letting rumors take the place of what ought to have been the truth. Above all, I was angry at how long it had taken to acknowledge the most human aspect of this story, a child's pain. A weird event occurred in the fallout. One name was noticeably missing from every public reference of the announcement as analysts pored over it. Camilla. She said nothing. It's not a quote. It was not a show of support. Her quiet was shocking for someone who had been outspoken about family issues, and those who were aware of the betrayal's backstory comprehended. Why? There was more to this event than a press release. It was a royal illusion gone bad. The curtain was up. The family, which was once seen to be intact, untarnished, impenetrable, and cohesive, had shown its weaknesses. The monarchy had always had to balance tradition with openness, but this time it had entirely failed. However, a deeper shadow hung behind the headlines as the public processed every sentence and analyzed every line, because there was more to come. While the comment provided an answer to one issue, it also opened the door to a much more hazardous one. But one last question lingered as the globe took in the news. What does this portend for the future of the monarchy? The solution might be more disastrous than anyone could have predicted. Prince Louis was always a part of the monarchy's long-term strategy, not merely a youngster. However, that plan is now falling apart. A silent struggle for succession has already started because of his uncertain future. And who controls the legacy is more important than who wears the crown. Each child has a symbolic position in the royal family's architecture. The heir, George. The stabilizer is Charlotte. Louis too. He was supposed to be the contemporary wild card, a representation of flexibility, charm, and fortitude. A monarch who would unite the ancient and the modern worlds. However, after spending months in the shadows, that story is no longer true. The palace never wanted to respond to the queries posed by the public. Where is Louis now? Will he ever come back? If not, what does such quiet signify for the establishment based on spectacle and succession? The mood has changed inside royal circles. Advisors have started creating new communication briefs, updated public strategies, backup succession plans, and contingency plans. The uncertainty has become unmanageable, not because they wish to replace Louis. A child can be hidden for a while. However, a question mark cannot be used to construct a throne. Once the most obedient member of the palace's staff, William is now at odds with the same organization that reared him. Above everything, he wants time, honesty, and protection. However, the crown is not patient. It relates with appearances. And the longer Louis is gone, the more the carefully cultivated image starts to show signs of deterioration. Behind-the-scenes tensions are boiling over. Silence falls after the end of meetings. Plans are at a standstill. Trust has turned into money, and it's hard to come by. The palace has responded by changing its emphasis. George, who was previously protected by tight privacy, is suddenly taking center stage. More public events, more pictures. He is positioned as the stable future in more headlines. Charlotte is also being repositioned as a possible future royal powerhouse in addition to being a helpful sibling. She is carefully cultivating her image because the family is preparing for a new structure behind the scenes, one that might not contain Louis as they had originally intended. Another catastrophe is quietly simmering while these internal actions take place. According to reports, King Charles, who is already under stress due to health rumors and family strife, is becoming weaker. He has suddenly aged due to the pressure to keep the monarchy intact. He has been characterized as being visibly reduced, burdened not only by his position, but also by the embarrassment that history might potentially repeat itself while he is in charge. Before Louis returns, there are murmurs, cautious and low, of completely changing the monarchy's image. A fresh appearance, a fresh approach, one that pulls the crown away from weakness and back toward might. Beneath all these ideas, however, is a reality that no advisor can change. The harm has been done. The fissures were visible to the public. They are unable to unsee them now. Thus, the effects have only just started, but the reality is no longer concealed. It was the crown's response to the disease, not the condition itself, that the palace feared most. Royal perfection was shattered by Prince Louis's silence. The question now haunts every appearance, every grin, every wave. Are they concealing anything else? We appreciate you watching, and we hope to see you in the future one. Please remember to like and subscribe.